All right, good evening and welcome to our continuing journey through the Gospel of John. Studies in John, we're on the 87th lesson and we are making the great jump into the 14th chapter. I call it a jump because you've got to jump past that invisible barrier that the translators put in called chapter breaks. And I've shared with you before that I think this is one of the more unfortunate chapter breaks. Honestly, one of the more unfortunate chapter breaks in the entire Bible. I say that because, and I'm backed up by a lot of commentary and scholarship on that issue, that this translation break caused us to miss the relief that Jesus gives to Peter after that entire rooster crowing passage, which we'll read in a little bit. It also pulls the reader away from why Jesus gives the "let not your heart be troubled" in the mansion speech, the believe my Father's house are many mansions. It pulls the reader away from the context of why he would say that. It puts it, unfortunately, in its own space in John 14, which almost subliminally causes the reader to think the topic has changed, that Jesus is suddenly speaking of something entirely different, which allows our minds, I think, to drift off into, oh, now Jesus is talking about a place called heaven, though he never says anything about a place called heaven in this passage. So I don't know what to do about it. We're not going to rewrite this and change where the chapter breaks. So what I'll do about it is teach it as if that chapter break is not there, because it wasn't there when John wrote it. It certainly wasn't there when Jesus said it. And if you then take that chapter break out, you have a little bit better basis of contextually understanding this chapter. And of course, that's the goal when we're studying, is to understand something contextually. So I want to read John 13:38 and John 14:1, and that will be the last verse of chapter 13 and the first verse of chapter 14. And I want to just start with this thought before I read it. One basic, simple premise. And this is where tonight really unfolds, is out of this thought, is that release from fear was always on Jesus' mind. What Jesus wanted to do was release his disciples from fear. He wanted to release the believer from fear. He never wants you and I to walk into fear. So you're going to see tonight in this text that Jesus knows some bad things are coming his way. Subsequently, some bad things are coming the disciples' way. And for all of us, some bad things are coming our way. But he doesn't deny the bad. He just always wants you to go face it without fear. So Jesus didn't get his disciple. Let me say that better. Jesus didn't take his disciples out of bad situations. In fact, sometimes Jesus went right into bad situations. But he instructed his disciples in every one of those bad situations to face it without fear. And so anything that puts fear in the heart of a believer should be taken to Christ to filter it through what Christ says about that situation. And then I'll take that a step further. Any theology or any ideology that puts fear in the heart of a believer between that believer and their Father, their Heavenly Father, should be considered an antichrist doctrine. That's my issue with bad eschatology. That's my issue with bad theology. Whatever it might be and whatever it might look like, is because if it's creating fear, then it can't be sourced from Jesus, because Jesus walked into terrible situations with his disciples and he never said, okay, you should be afraid. Or, hey, if you guys are scared, I get it. This is a tough one. Never. And so that tells me that it's not the heart of the Father to put fear. We'll come back to that idea in a little while, but I wanted that to be the basis of which you work tonight, to understand that the fear is not from the Father. So look at our two verses. Jesus answered him, talking to Peter, and said, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. I personally believe, because the Greek doesn't give us... Let me broaden this thought for a second. Throughout most of the English language, we have not used punctuation. I think the reason for that is because we didn't have it in the ancient world. So when you read from the Greek, there's no periods, question marks, exclamation points, quote marks, parentheses. There's jots and tittles. Jesus talks about the jot and the tittle. These are little accent marks or little marks to help the reader understand something better, but they didn't have punctuation the way we do. So when the English language, which is not that old relative to the written and spoken languages of the world, began to write things down, punctuation was one of the last things we thought to do because we didn't cut our literary teeth on punctuation. If you were reading classic Greek or Latin, you were without. So when the English language began, we didn't do it. You'll go back and read things from the 16th century. You'll notice that sometimes there's no capitalization. Paragraphs are almost non-existent. Not only are words spelled differently, but there's no period where there should be, or maybe there's no comma. Even up into the writings of our founding fathers, you go back through the diaries of Jefferson and the letters of John Adams and Abigail. It's strange how you'll read them, when you read them in their original prose, you'll hear them say something and think, wow, that's beautiful. And then you'll go Google it and realize it's Shakespeare. But they didn't put quotes around it. They didn't put a comma going into it. They didn't put a quote going around it. And so you're just running on. It's just all this stuff, and you don't know where to put the stuff, and you kind of have to figure it out. Welcome to Greek, where that doesn't exist either. So not only when the translators take the text do they break it into chapters and verses, but they also then have to put semicolons and colons and commas and periods. And you'll notice as the newer translations come along, they drop a lot of semicolons. The King James and the New King James love semicolons, sometimes used inappropriately, but there they are. And you'll notice that the newer translations drop some of that stuff because they're trying to clean it up a little bit in the way it reads. I brought all of that up. I told you I was going to fatten that up a little bit. Welcome to Bible study, where sometimes you study the sides, the edges. I say all that because when you read the scriptures, realize that sometimes we don't really know where the period goes. We don't really know. We don't really know that there's supposed to be a comma there. If you read them with the punctuation in different spots, you get different meanings. Now, we've had years of scholarship and years of research, and I'm not in any way insinuating that they've done it wrong or that I'm somehow figured something out. So, tip of the cap to those that went before us. Whatever we see, it's because we stand on the shoulders of better men. But let's just imagine for a moment that since this translation break didn't exist, that maybe, just maybe, that semicolon in the middle of verse 1 is not in the right place. That maybe that should have been a period. And maybe after 3 times, the last 2 words of verse 38, 3 times, maybe there shouldn't have been a period. Maybe there should have been a comma. Maybe that should have been the semicolon. I mentioned that last week. I want to start there this week. So think about it this way. Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you've denied me 3 times. Let not your heart be troubled. So I think that let not your heart be troubled is a beautiful poetic passage that's lost some of its power to us because it is 14:1 instead of 13:38. And I think what let not your heart be troubled is saying is that in the midst of the greatest trial of your life, You know who you are and you know what you have, so let not your heart be troubled. Not, I'm a God that keeps you out of trials. I'm a God that keeps you out of failure. But rather, I'm a God that settles your heart in the midst of trial and settles your heart in the midst of failure. So let not your heart be troubled. I would say this as well. You are useless to release people from trouble if you haven't faced the darkness yourself. You're not going to do much for people as far as getting them out of a place of struggle if you haven't been pulled through some struggle. And when you face it, you are going to learn the things in your life and in your walk that deserve your attention and the things in your life and walk that don't deserve your attention. And you don't learn that, I don't think, if you don't go through some adversity and you don't go through some trouble and you don't go through some heartache. You don't learn what's important and what's not. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to put things into order as to what deserves the most amount of your time and what doesn't. Some things are worth being more concerned over than others. You don't learn any of that until you start to go through some things and then realize what it is that you need to do. And another thing is, when you keep other people from confronting their trouble, you might think you're helping them through life, but if you keep people from encountering trouble long enough, you rob them from the joy of overcoming. And you rob them from the version of themselves they could be when they get out the other side. And that is a tragedy. I don't want to make too big of an issue of this because it's possibly more of a distraction to the text, but I'll just briefly say I think we have to evaluate in our own culture at what point we're willing to go back out in the midst of, say, quarantine. What point are we willing to go back out and risk infection or risk getting sick because the alternative of never allowing a virus to invade our bodies so that our body doesn't build up any kind of immunity? Where do we get to the point where we go, if we stay in any longer, we've destroyed our immune system, then we go out, we get sick off stuff we would have never been sick off of, whereas if we had faced a little bit, we'd be stronger. That might be a terrible illustration. I'm no virologist, so you don't take medical advice from me, but in a practical sense, at what point do we need some confrontation with it in order to overcome it? And I think it works in our own lives spiritually. At what point are we stepping back from what we could be by running away from trouble? I want to show you that the only reason that Jesus can say in John, it's easy to say, well, Jesus can say, let not your heart be troubled. He's Jesus, right? I mean, if anybody can say, let not your heart be troubled, it's Jesus. I mean, he knows who the Father is, and he knows what heaven looks like, and he knows where he's going after the resurrection. But that's not fair, because Jesus is moving through the earth as a man. He's learning as he goes what it means to be human. And if not, then there's nothing that you can learn from him, because it's just God having his way easily. He's not really being tempted. He overcomes everything because he's God. The flip side, the alternative is he's a man and he's learning and he's overcoming and he's going through struggle. So what gives Jesus the right, if we can be so bold to say this, what gives Jesus the right in John 14:1 to say, let not your heart be troubled? What's he know? What's he know about his heart being troubled? Look at John 12:27. I want to take you back, one in John 12, one in John 13. Look at John 12:27. Jesus says this, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. According to John 12, Jesus was troubled. What was he troubled about? He was troubled about going to the cross. He said, what am I going to say though? I don't want to go. In other words, I'm troubled and I'm struggling with what I'm troubled with, but the alternative is not going to the cross. The alternative is not judging sin and evil. He goes on down there to say, now's the judgment of this world. Now's the prince of this world cast out. You lift me up, all the judgment's going to come in. So what's the alternative to running from trouble? Run from trouble because you don't like trouble. And what do you get? You don't go to Calvary and the judgment isn't poured into Christ. Jesus considered that unacceptable. Trouble was the price he had to pay. Look at this one, John 13:21. We were here just a few weeks ago. Look at 20:21. Assuredly I say to you, who receives me, he who receives whomever I send receives me. He who receives me receives him who sent me. Jesus said these things and was troubled in spirit and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. So why is he troubled in John 13? Because he's about to be betrayed. This is interesting. Catch what John the writer does. He gives you John 12, Jesus is troubled because he's going to the cross. John 13, Jesus is troubled because he's going to be betrayed. John 14, he turns to the crowd, the disciples, and says, let not your heart be troubled. And the interesting thing is that in the troubled passage from 12 and the troubled passage from 13, the people he tells that he's troubled to are his disciples. To his disciples, he goes, I'm troubled. I got to do my Father's will. I'm troubled. One of you is going to betray me. And then, let not your heart be troubled. So, Jesus was troubled facing death, and Jesus was troubled facing betrayal, but he then got clarity so that he could speak from a place of peace. He got clarity about the cross. He goes, now is the judgment of this world. I can't walk away from this. I got to face the trouble that's given me. Someone's going to betray me, but you know what? It's got to be this way. So he's able to face his trouble in both situations, and he comes out with clarity, and then he can go right into what he's got to do. Even though he's got to go down into trouble, he can go down into trouble from a place of peace. And from that, Jesus says, don't be troubled, because I'm going to make a way for you to know my Father. There's no reason for trouble to hit you. I want to go back to something we said a moment ago when we were starting about the entire heart of the Father, the entire heart of Jesus, is to release you from fear. It's to take you into a place where you do not have to be scared, where you do not have to be afraid. It's not just the heart of Jesus. It was truly the heart of God. But where it really begins to come to bear in the Old Testament is in the prophecies surrounding Jesus. It's as if in the Old Testament, the farther back you go, you see, and what I mean by that is at the beginning of the book, of Old Testament writings, all the way up into the prophecies, you see a people who are relatively afraid of God. And why wouldn't they be, based upon the experiences they have? Then as God begins to release this prophetic language, particularly through people like Isaiah, God begins to introduce him by telling Israel not to fear. It's as if God's sending this message, almost coded, like, I'm going to show up in human form, don't be afraid. Because every time in the Old Testament God shows up, people freak out. You know, every time they wrestle with an angel or they encounter the heavenly beings, they fall on their face and afraid. Every text, they're afraid they're going to die. Because the idea was if you saw an angel, he was coming to take you. And so if you saw God, you were going to die. So when God starts to speak of his own release into the earth, where he's going to unleash himself as a man, he has to preface it with fear not, because their whole mentality was to fear. Look at Isaiah 41:10. Let me show you one of those. This is a Christ prophecy from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed. I am your Lord. I am your God. I'll strengthen you. Yes, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. By the way, the verse in front of that, he says, that he has chosen his servant that he's not going to cast away. That's a Jesus prophecy. So when he unleashes the Jesus prophecy, he unleashes fear not. So what God is saying to Israel is, don't be afraid, fear not. Why should you not fear? Because I'm God. I'm going to strengthen you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to uphold you with my righteous right hand, or I'm going to uphold you with my righteousness. Here's an example of how Jesus lays this out. Look at Matthew 14. And this is that famous moment where Jesus comes walking on the Sea of Galilee. And Peter, of course, if it's you, bid me to come. But before Peter ever tries to walk on the water, before the sinking and all of those things, the disciples, in verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. But immediately, Jesus doesn't even let them stay in that state, because it's not the heart of the Father to put you in fear. It's not the heart of the Father to put you in fear, or to keep you in fear, or to leave you in fear. Ever. It's the antithesis of the heart of someone that loves you. It's one thing to let your kids go through trouble. It's one thing to let your kids get hurt. They need it. They need a little hurt. They need a little trouble. They need a little conflict. They need a little fight. They need a little wrestle. They don't need to be scared. Fear, I don't mean they don't need to be nervous or anxious sometimes, that it might not strengthen how they act. There's no reason to live in fear. Fear cripples and debilitates and breaks people down, doesn't build them up. So Jesus doesn't come and instill fear. He doesn't come to scare people, because scaring you guys is going to make you stronger. No, scaring you guys is going to cause someone to kill themselves. Scaring you guys is going to cause someone to jump overboard and drown in the middle of a storm. So immediately he needs to speak, because he's got a bunch of guys on a boat in a storm freaking out. And so immediately he says to them, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And "be of good cheer" becomes the watchword of the disciples. It becomes how they conduct themselves, that they are not afraid, that they walk through life almost incapable of fear. Look at the stuff these guys go through in the book of Acts, and they walk through it fearless. Is it because they're bolder than we are? They have more courage than we have? Or is it because they watched Jesus go into and out of trouble and realized that if he went through it, as he is, so are they in this world. So he's going to go into and out of trouble with them as well. And so if he says don't be afraid, it's because he knows what's on the other side. Here's a little principle for you. Maybe not some sort of principle for life, but just a point that I think the Bible makes. We only fear because we have forgotten. We only fear because we forgot. We've forgotten how good God is. We forgot how much he loved us. We forgot how forgiven we are. We forgot what he did yesterday. And we fear. And every time I ever think, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to make it? And then I get nervous and I start to get afraid. I realize that the only reason I feel that way is I forgot that I've been here before. I forgot that I was here and it was worse. And I'm still here. And he delivered me. And he picked me up. And I learned lessons. And that if I wouldn't forget that, I could face it without fear. We only fear because we forgot. And the Bible supports us in that. Here's how. I want to show you the same story. I want you to look at the same walking on the sea story from Mark's version, Mark 6. All right, Mark chapter 6, verse 50. And this is the same Jesus walking on the water story from Matthew 14 with a very interesting postscript, a little PS at the end. For verse 50, for they all saw him and were troubled. Look at that. There's that word troubled. That's our subtitle. Let not your heart be troubled. They were all troubled, but immediately he talked with them. Mark does the same thing Matthew does. Immediate. Don't let them stay there if trouble's going to lead to fear. So how are we going to equip them? He talked with them and said to them, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. Now look at the little postscript in 52. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. I think one translation says, they had forgotten about the loaves. They forgot the loaves. What's that mean? This story is on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus, and you and I have studied that together in this series. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a boy's lunch. He thanks the Father and then gives the provision. The greatest miracle in the world in that day was food. Instantaneous food. Food we didn't have to grow. Food we didn't have to barter and trade for. Food we didn't have to wonder where we were going to find it. Food with 12 baskets leftovers. Greatest miracle the ancient world knew. It's why every gospel records it. Because unbelievable that poverty-stricken world where people are starving to death can have instant food for free. Amazing miracle. If God could do that, he could do anything. Mark believed that the reason they were so afraid of what they saw, the reason they were so amazed at what they saw, is because they had already forgotten that God had fed a bunch of hungry people using nothing but a kid's lunch. And the faster we forget how good God is and what God has done and what God can do, the faster we roll over into fear because we forgot the provision of the Father and how wonderful that he is. Don't forget the loaves. What's that mean for our story? Remember, in John, they've just had the communion. Jesus passes the cup and the bread across the table. Take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood. My goodness, John 13 opens with an after supper. He got down. So John's using the image of they had bread, they had provision, they had loaves, and then they were troubled because it's the pattern that we go through. We get provided for, we forget we were provided for because we forgot we were provided for. We freak out. We wonder if we're going to be provided for again. And our role is not to worry about provision and sustenance, but to remember that our Father has us taken care of, that he has solved it. I think it's why the communion ceremony, Jesus tells Paul in 1 Corinthians, when Paul tells us about communion, I believe it's why Jesus says, as often as you do this, remember me. Remember me? What's that mean? Remember that I died? Remember? You people are so quick to forget, he's saying. You're so quick to forget. Remember me. Don't forget me. If you forget me, you're going to be afraid. If you're afraid, you're going to be troubled, and that's going to swallow you up. But Jesus can release us in that moment of trouble because he's faced it, and he knows how to get us through it, and he knows how to get us through it without the trouble turning into fear. The kind that cripples us, the kind that breaks us, the kind that puts us in high anxiety. I think anxiety sometimes is the end result of a fear gone to seed, the kind of fear in which we've forgotten how loved we are, how appreciated we are, how comforted we are, how provided for we are, and we're afraid that it won't be there tomorrow. We're afraid that and sometimes that's a guilt and shame and condemnation result because we're so full of condemnation over what we're doing or what we're thinking or what we've done. It could have been years ago, but we're still dragging. That's why I believe you've got to go confront that junk in your wilderness. You've got to go take Jesus into the wilderness with you and hold your hand and go face that enemy. Because if you keep covering it up and clouding it over, and you don't lay it bare at the cross and be resurrected from it, then it becomes a part of you. You're not meant to carry it. You're a new creation, but you keep carrying it, and I think it causes you to wonder if you're really good enough, and if God really loves you, and if you're really forgiven, and if you're really what he says you are. And when that happens, I think anxiety sets in. I think fear sets in, and then we get crippled. And it's staring, I'm going to say that differently. It's that refusal to lay that bare before the Father. Sometimes it's the refusal to acknowledge that we're in trouble. Like, what if Jesus thinks, it's better to just confess positive things? So even though I'm very troubled about going to the cross, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say I'm troubled, because I don't want my disciples to know I'm troubled. Oh, one of them's going to betray me? I'm not going to tell them that bothers me. I don't want them to know it bothers me. I don't want them to know I'm troubled about it. Now, what's the end result of that? He can't say, John 14:1, let not your heart be troubled. Because he hasn't given them the example of being troubled and getting over it. So now he's a liar. And that's what it means to tell the truth. It's not just, did you do that? Yeah. Are you telling the truth? Telling the truth is, I'm troubled. And I want to face it without fear. And I want to come through it. And so I think there's an important aspect to the fact that Jesus has been down that road, is why he can release them from that road, or release them in that, to face it and be equipped to face it. So let not your heart be troubled. Specifically, Peter, don't let your heart be troubled. You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, but don't let your heart be troubled. Like we said last week, when the rooster crows, the sun's coming up. So why would you let your heart be troubled? You got a brand new day in front of you. But let's broaden it. Broaden it. Broaden it to the rest of the disciples. Broaden it to you and I, because we're the ones reading this. And by the way, John wrote this so that believing in his name you'd have life. So why'd he throw this in? He's writing to unbelievers, and he's saying to them, don't let your heart be troubled. How? How is an unbeliever? And that segues you into that next passage. You believe in God, believe also in me. And so, I'm going to try to bring those thoughts together, because it's one continuous thought that Jesus has going. Hey, Peter, I know you're going to fail me. You think you're ready, you're not ready. You will be ready someday, but you're not ready right now. In fact, before the night's over, you're going to deny me 3 times, but don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God. You have faith in, you believe in my Father. You have faith in my Father. I want you to believe the same for me. So I want to bring out why that's vital. Why is it important that we remember that believing in God, thus believing in Jesus, is a part of us not allowing our hearts to be troubled? Again, just to make sure we understand this, Jesus is not saying, don't get into trouble. I don't let my people get into trouble. You're not going to have any trouble. All that's a lie. You go into trouble all the time, and God knows you're going into trouble. And some of it you got to go through. It's just life. But he says, let not your heart be troubled. So it's one thing to go into trouble. It's another thing to have trouble come into you, kind of thing, to where it just cripples you. So out of that let me go back there. That 14th chapter, verse 1, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Out of that, we need to make some determinations about what Jesus' contextual audience would have seen. First of all, dealing with an audience that has God as the centerpiece of their faith, Jesus is asking a lot of people to say, you believe in God, I want you to believe in me in the same manner. And that technically is what Jesus is saying. He's not asking you, you believe in God, I wish you'd kind of believe in me. It's not a pity party. But I also think we should see it through a certain lens. Don't see these words as either a demand or a command. Hey, you people believe in God, you're supposed to believe in me too. See these words as an invitation to believe who Jesus is with equal force in which you believe in God. So don't see it as a hammering instruction. See it as an invite. And I think if we'll treat Jesus that way, because Jesus is a come unto me Jesus. Come unto me. Come and dine. That's what he says to the disciples. Come and dine. That's what Matthew 11. Come unto me. Yep, those of you who are laboring and heavy laden. He's a come here guy. Come on over here. He's an invitation guy. He invites you in. He's what we would call inviting, so that you feel at rest. You feel comfortable. That's why he's anti-fear. Because you can't be inviting and freak people out at the same time. There's no one that's inviting that scares people. So that's why fear had to be pushed out. So see it as an invitation into something deeper. And I think when we do that, this makes Christianity, it marks Christianity as a faith that is ultimately completely separate from Judaism. This moment right here, John 14:1. It's the real start of believing in me is not going to be like Judaism, because Judaism is believe in God and obey His commands. Jesus says, I'm asking you to believe in me with the same force, the same veracity, the same faith in which you believe in God. This invitation to believe in Jesus is necessary in order to see God properly. Without Jesus, God could be seen as tribal, cold, and demanding. He does little to comfort, and He inspires people through fear. But in Jesus, God becomes what our soul longs for. I want to work on that for a minute, that whole thought. I want you to think about that. The invitation that Jesus gives to believe in Him as you believe in God is necessary in order for you to see God the way Jesus saw Him. Because until Jesus, man did not have any true image of what God looked like. Some people take me to task when I say things like, well, you see God in the Old Testament, but you're seeing an incomplete picture of God because you're seeing how God looked through man's eyes. And some don't take too well to that, because they say, well, that isn't that saying that those scriptures in the Old Testament aren't telling the whole truth? I won't dare make that statement, but I will say Jesus is the truth. So if you want to know the truth, you're not going to know it without Jesus. And I don't mean truth as an answer. I mean truth as a journey. If you want to know the journey of truth, you're going to see it through Jesus. So I would say if you want to know what God looks like, you can get an image of God by reading the Old Testament. Like if someone were to say, do you think I could learn about God if I were to read the Bible? I would say yes, but be careful where you start. If you say, well, why should I be careful where I start? I say, well, because if you want to see God as men see God, then you should probably stay in the Old Testament. But if you want to see God the way Jesus saw God, then you need to stay in the Gospels. If you want to see God the way man sees God through Jesus, then you want to read the epistles in the New Testament. But if you want to see the Father as Jesus was trying to portray Him, then you need to read the Gospels. And you might say, well, and I've heard people make the argument that, and they're not scholars. I mean, we're talking a lot of times about even non-believers, but they do see a distinction. And they'll go, boy, that guy preaches a real Old Testament God. And what they mean by that is it looks like the God that's a bit tribal and sometimes cold and sometimes distant. And what they mean by a New Testament God is it looks more like Jesus. And that's a pretty good way to say that, really, out of the mouth of babes, right? Jesus is showing you what the Father looks like. So when He says, let not your heart be troubled, you believe in God, believe in me, Jesus is saying that your hearts don't need to be troubled over Peter, you don't need to be troubled over what's going to happen with the rooster because you're going to have a new tomorrow. B, you don't need to be troubled over God because I want you to believe in me in the same force. And where this passage is going is Jesus is going to introduce you to the Father. And so ultimately, in Jesus, I'm kind of dancing around saying this the exact way I want to. Let me just say it. I think you can have a version of God without Jesus. I think every religion in the world has God without Jesus. And I think you can serve God. And I think you can have a good ethic. I really do. I think you can have a bad one too. I really do. I've watched people over the last few weeks of posting sermons, and I've watched some bad ethic, and they're quoting Bible. I think the same thing probably happens a lot of times when we hear the Quran quoted. I've never read the Quran, not all of it, but we'll hear the Quran quoted, and it's some vicious, murderous verse, and we'll go, see, that's the Muslim faith for you right there. And I always cringe when I see people do that because I think, I don't want to get in that arena. Because if you're just going to pick verses that sound the way you want them to sound, this one's got some really tough ones. Especially back here. Like some really tough ones. To just lay out there with no context and go, here's what God looks like. And if you do that, if people were to do that, they could go, see what kind of belief system Christianity is? And I think that's probably been happening through this. I think there's been people who don't know anything, and they see a meme of somebody quoting some Old Testament, and they go, man, why would anybody go sit through that every week? What's wrong with these Christians? Why do they feel that way? So the whole pick a verse, here a verse, there a verse, everywhere a verse version of Christianity is bogus. And it's a terrible narrative, a terrible hermeneutic, rather, because it's a non-Christocentric hermeneutic. And Christ comes to show you what the Father really looks like, what he sounds like, what he moves like, what he loves like. And here's the beauty. Jesus doesn't come defining his ministry by morality. Jesus doesn't come defining his ministry by the lack of sin. He doesn't say to his disciples, people are going to know your mind if you boys don't sin. If you guys will live right, people will know you're a part of my family. Never. That sounds more like preachers I heard growing up than it does the Jesus of the Gospels. What Jesus said is, they're going to know your mind because you love people. That's going to be the bottom line judgment. Because you're going to love, and they're going to go, boy, that guy looks like Jesus because he loves. I was talking to a minister today on the phone. We got to talking about good man of God, good grace guy, great pastor. Well, if you're going to say that, you ought to say it. It's Dan Morrison. If you're going to say he's a good grace guy, good pastor, say his name, right? Give him some props. Dan pastors a church in Leesburg, Missouri. We were talking today, having a great time discussing, and I got on a rant, kind of preached a little mini sermon. He got excited. He starts amening me. It was fun. That's the way it goes. We were talking about that thought that the church has so often confused her role. We think that our role is to teach people morality and celebrate when they do right. No, that's a John the Baptist ministry. John the Baptist has people bring fruits meet for repentance. John gives them instructions on how to live right. John calls Herod on the carpet for his adultery and goes to prison for it, and it costs him his head. The cost of a high morality ministry for John was his life. Now you can celebrate it all you want and go, you should applaud that. That's the way to go. Jesus faced the same Herod and didn't do it. When Jesus was confronted with adultery, he said, you know where I'm going, John 8. He without sin among you cast the first stone. So you have to make a decision what hill you want to die on. You can die on the go to prison hill. You can die on the hill of go to prison because you took a spiritual stand for morality, or you can die on the hill of Calvary, facing the dark night of the soul. You get my point? I haven't developed it. I'm not rounding it out. I don't know that I will, but I'm just, the thought process for me is that Christianity has, for too many people, become a system of moral codes whereby they determine their own position and the position of their neighbor through a moral lens, instead of a kingdom that spreads through loving your neighbor and your enemy and showing the kindness of God to people who are unthankful and evil. I don't know if you guys caught my Sunday sermon that I posted, a disproportionate response. Man, I got fired up in there over Luke 6:35, where Jesus says, God is kind to the unthankful and the evil. I mean, that wrecked me. I just could not get over that statement. Can you imagine? That ought to be the theme of the church. God is kind to the unthankful and the evil. Can you imagine if a church put that on their sign? Can you imagine if they actually made that their theme? Welcome to our church, where God is kind to unthankful and evil people. And you'd have more scripture to back that than the garbage that gets promoted oftentimes. And you'd be quoting Jesus. You can't do better than Jesus. He's kind to the unthankful and the evil. All right, I want to read a few verses. Go to Hebrews 1, and I want to show you why I believe Jesus is the image of the Father. And if he says, believe in God, believe also in me, here's what the New Testament has to say about that. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. God, who at various times and in various ways, that's many portions. God, through many different portions, spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the world. I ran the risk when I put this on the notes that if I go to Hebrews, it gets too long. So I'm going to try not to go crazy here. But God isn't speaking to you through anything but Jesus. He's not. He used to speak at various times and in various ways. That's time to time, different ways, through the prophets. In these last days, and that's their last day, the last days of that old system. But it still applies to you because it's what God's saying through Jesus. In these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. When you don't know what God's saying, listen to Jesus. Don't give me a yeah, but either. Oh, yeah, but what about this scripture way back here where God said this? He spoke from time to time through prophets, but now he's speaking to you through Jesus. You want to know what God looks like? You better go to Jesus. If you're not going to Jesus, don't quote for me your 7 scriptures on what you think God's doing in this hour. Because if it isn't through Jesus, it's not the voice of the Father. He's heir of all things, through whom he made the worlds. Look at what Christ is in verse 3. He's the brightness of the glory of God. He's the express image of the person of God. And he upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. So what inheritance that you and I get, we get because Jesus has first received the inheritance. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God? Believe in Jesus. Because I would say this on the other side of the cross. If you believe in God and don't believe in Jesus, you can believe in God, but you won't know the heart of a father. You'll have a God, but you won't have a father. And that's where Jesus is going with this passage. Now, it's going to take a few weeks to get there because we're going to work next week on in my Father's house, that whole mansion passage. And I want to show you how translation has affected it, but it's so much better than we think. And I'll say this as our closer. It's not so much about going to heaven. It's even better than that when we read it the way Jesus said it. Father, thank you for the word tonight. Thank you for what you've said to us. Thank you that in the middle of trouble, our hearts don't have to be troubled. That in the middle of trouble, you hold our hand because you faced trouble. Help those of us who are struggling with anxiety and fear. May we see that you have walked through it so we can walk through it, and let not our heart be troubled. When we think of God, may we think of Jesus. And when we think of Jesus, may we think no fear. And may we realize we're seeing the heart of Daddy. Thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen.